everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got one panelist who will be joining us in just a few minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started since we've got you here. My name is Dr. Rachel Buhner. I am the former president of the Kentucky Psychological Association. KPA and the Kentucky Psychological Foundation are proud to bring you today's panel discussion. We're going to be talking about student-athlete suicide today, what to look for, what to do, what to say. This talk is for programs, for coaches, for families, and for players as well. Anybody who has a stake in the well-being of young people, particularly young people who play sports, there is something here for you today. Our hope is that you finish this panel discussion either today or watching the recording in the future, and you have something to talk about at the kitchen table tonight with your players, next week at practice, in your next staff meeting with your program staff. So we really hope to give you something to work with today. I'm going to introduce you to our panel here in just a second, but I wanted to give you just some statistics to let you know why it is that we're here. We know in the last 20 years that the suicide rates for young people have gone up. Here recently, more children are attempting suicide. They are engaging in self-injurious behavior. We're seeing more ER visits for this type of stuff for young people. This is a problem that got worse during the pandemic. We've lost at least six NCAA athletes in recent months to suicide. This is a problem we are ready to address. This is a problem that we can prevent. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our panel. Dr. Christopher Peters is a physician with Norton Health and with the University of Louisville. Good morning, Dr. Peters. Dr. Ben Berkby is a sports psychologist and clinical psychologist here in Kentucky. Got Vanessa Shannon. Dr. Shannon is used to be with the University of Louisville. She has just started as the Director of Mental Performance with the Cincinnati Reds. Is that right, Dr. Shannon?
That's correct.
Wonderful. Dr. Mark Cormier is at the University of Kentucky. He is an associate professor and director of the Sports and Exercise Psychology program out there. Good morning, Dr. Cormier.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Dr. Kate O'Brien is a licensed clinical social worker, and she is the L-Care lead coordinator at the University of Louisville. Good morning, Kate. Wonderful. So I'd like to jump on in if that's okay. Dr. Peters, can you kind of lay the groundwork for us? We're going to cover a lot of things today about some things that can go wrong and how to intervene, but tell us about some of the benefits of young people participating in sports.
Thank you very much. So, when we all think about trying to live a healthy life, we think of the general things, right? Of eating healthier, eat right, get plenty of rest, and exercise is a big component of that. And so if we want to help all of us develop that love of being active and exercise, one of the venues, right? One of the avenues for that is certainly sports participation. And starting with young people as they age up and hopefully getting them to really see this as part of their long life journey. Being active is kind of ubiquitous with the sports participation. And I kind of think of the benefits as biopsychosocial, right? So biologically, that's the easy answer. We get stronger, our bone systems mature well. Our cardiovascular and pulmonary benefits are clear. But when you kind of think in terms of the mental health benefits, maybe it's not as clear. I think of sports participation as being a great cheat sheet for life skill, right? So if you think about opportunities that a developing athlete has, they push through and beyond what they sort of think they can do. It sort of puts them at times in adversity situations, either individually or with a team. So learning to work either individually or together to get through an adverse moment. I think it teaches persistence, sticking with something even when it gets difficult. And as a byproduct of that, it can be somewhere where you can develop resilience and improve your self-confidence. In terms of that, it also allows a venue for team sports where you may interact with folks you wouldn't normally have interacted with from different backgrounds, and gives you some exposure to some diversity that maybe you wouldn't have accessed as easily if you weren't participating. And I think the other thing that I was thinking of is our athletes have a unique platform, and within our culture, athletics has a broad reach, for participants as well as fans. And so our athletes, really have that ability to touch others through that participation. And so it can become part of a service driven process too for their lifelong journey. So I think there's lots of benefits to be had, both biologically as well as psychosocially, which is why we're all gathered here today.
Very good. Lots of good to be found there. Dr. Cormier, tell us about the association sort of between mental health and mental performance. I think we make a lot of assumptions about athletes being mentally tough, but how do we build that? How do they build that? How do we sustain it?
We do. And I think, for a long time, it seems that most of the general population were under the impression that mental toughness was synonymous with mental health. In other words, if an athlete is high performing, they must be mentally healthy. I've heard people talk about, what does Michael Phelps have to be sad about with all those medals and money and things like that? So of course, we now know, and mostly due to advocacy from athletes like Phelps, which is, continuing recently with Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, and that these are separate concepts. A championship mindset, mental toughness, whatever you want to call it, has to do with their sport and their performance. And it doesn't magically allow an athlete to tough things out when they're faced with, struggles, such as depression or anxiety or something like that. There's obviously some crossover in that, like something like depression or anxiety can impact a person's performance. So clearly, if an athlete is struggling, we first look to see whether there's underlying reasons for why the person is disengaged, lacking enthusiasm or energy, or underperforming based on their capabilities and things like that. But the absence of that influence is not an indication that mental illness isn't there. In other words, just because the person is a high performer doesn't negate any personal struggles. There's a really good documentary that I watched recently and I showed in one of my courses. It's on HBO and it's called The Weight of Gold, which discusses the struggles of being an Olympic athlete, which sheds a lot of light on how these concepts, mental health and mental toughness, are separate entities, but can also influence each other. Specifically, they chronicle the experiences of a handful of former Olympians and discuss the silent struggles they experience, some of which are due to their athletic experiences and the pressure that they had or felt, from being an elite performer and things like that. And I think a major problem that we have with this is that most psychology professionals, so whether you are a licensed counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, a social worker, or a CMPC, which is a certified mental performance consultant, is that most psychology professionals aren't courtside every day. We try to be present. We try to get to know the student athletes or the athletes or whomever we're working with as much as possible. But ultimately, we can't divide ourselves into 100 pieces. I work with all 22 of our programs here at the University of Kentucky, so it's impossible for me to be everywhere. So we rely heavily on the ones that are present. My network of people that are my eyes and ears at UK include athletic trainers, coaches, strength conditioning personnel, and even GAs. I call them my boots on the ground. They have tremendous trust established with our athletes, which means that our athletes are more likely to disclose any personal struggles with them than they are with, somebody who works down the hall in some building on campus. So one step that we took here at UK was recently to provide all members of the athletic staff the opportunity to complete mental health first aid. And as the name suggests, this is a first aid course for mental health, teaching our staff members to assess the situation, ask the right questions, and make the right decisions and how to refer. We're not training these people how to treat or diagnose anything, but we want to make sure that we're not allowing, and back to the question, the illusion of mental toughness or high performance to cloud any concerns that might be there.
Wonderful. That's really good to hear about all the work you're doing out there at UK. Dr. Shannon, talk a little bit with us about how pressure impacts performance. In particular, I want to know more about how do players effectively and in a healthy way leave a missed shot or a lost game behind without taking that with them, without letting that, over the long haul negatively impact them?
That's a great question, Rachel. I think pressure impacts performance in a number of different ways, or I guess a number of different types of pressure can impact performance, whether it's social pressure, parental pressure, internal pressure that we place on ourselves as athletes. All of those things can influence performance. The challenge with recovering from failure and leaving mistakes really comes from how we interact with or experience that pressure. For whatever reason, a lot of athletes grow up within their sport careers believing that pressure is a bad thing, and the acknowledgement of pressure influencing you is a bad thing. It's seen as a deficiency or a weakness. And so as a consequence, what athletes will often do as a maladjusted coping mechanism is that they will ignore the pressure, or they will refuse to acknowledge the way in which the pressure is impacting them. Those are not great strategies. They typically lead to greater deficiencies in performance as a consequence of the pressure. If we could put in the chat, or maybe it's already in there, there's a great TED Talk by Dr. Susan David, a psychologist at Harvard. It's called The Gift and Power of Emotional Courage. And she wrote a book called Emotional Agility. And she talks about being emotionally agile, just like we're physically agile, working through our weaknesses, growing strengths in that area. And in the work that I do with athletes, and most of us on this webinar, we're taking sort of an acceptance and commitment approach. We're asking the athlete to acknowledge the pressure, to accept the pressure as normal, so that then they can adjust to the pressure. And ultimately, that's how athletes can learn to tolerate the pressure, but also learn to recover from mistakes. Mistakes happen. Recently, and I'm not going to remember the reference, but an athlete was sharing with me that they'd seen an interview with Kobe Bryant, and Kobe Bryant was asked about failure and losing. And he said he grew to appreciate failure and loss way more in his career than success, because he could actually become better as a consequence of failure and loss. He could learn about his deficiencies and his weaknesses, and he could grow from those. Whereas it's quite difficult to see that in success. Sometimes we just kind of, sink into the success and aren't able to see those things as clearly. So the best way to recover from mistakes and kind of process them and put them behind us is to acknowledge, okay, I made a mistake. I had an experience with failure here. That's normal. It's going to be a part of my career. I don't love that it happened. I want to fix it. I want to do something about it. So what can I learn from this mistake or this experience or this loss, and how can I grow as a consequence of it?
Very good. And it seems to you like this is a real movement that's happening, where we're talking more about the impact of pressure versus just not talking about it.
We are, certainly all the people on this call. I think sometimes our coaches, right, can still, without even realizing it, create an environment where our athletes are a bit emotionally rigid and unwilling to acknowledge how they're feeling, how they're experiencing the pressure, how they're experiencing the failure. I think at times unintentionally, parents, teachers, everybody, right, we can all do it. I even find myself with my nephews occasionally saying things to them like, find a way, right? Without really just asking them like, what are you frustrated about? I get it. I'd be frustrated too. What are you going to do about it, right? That's sort of a better solution. Another resource I would recommend in this space is a great book by Dr. Mark Brackett called Permission to Feel. So I think ultimately it's about creating a safe space where we all have the permission, not just from others, but we're granting it to ourselves to acknowledge how we feel, so that then we can process how we feel and we can move beyond how we feel.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kate O'Brien, I was interacting with an athlete this week, and she was talking a little bit about her experience playing basketball in college so far. It's not really talked about mental health, not at least at the program level at the school where she is. And I was wondering, you've worked with athletes for a long time. Are we talking more about mental health? Are we talking about it in locker rooms? Are we talking about it more at a programs level? Like, what sort of changes or trends have you seen?
We better be talking about it more. Me, Dr. Peters, and Dr. Shannon have hammered it in for the past, 3 years. So we better hear some dialogue. Our approach, top down, to and through the coach. We really, Dr. Shannon's done a phenomenal amount of work with the coaching staff. Like, when you think about mental health and how we prepare athletes at U of L, we've really tried to dive into almost like a family structure of diving into coaches and teaching them the right verbiage, but more importantly, teaching them just open the conversation. You don't have to go into detail, but putting it on the table, you handle it just like you do really anything else. If you don't say anything, athletes will create their own narrative. So that's dangerous. So we encourage them to say something and not to wait. So we had this string of unfortunate events with some Division I college athletes in the past 6 months. And I got a lot of emails and texts from coaches. What do we do? It's an unfortunate occurrence, absolutely, but this is the best time to bring it up because they're already thinking about it. It's fresh on their mind. It's in their face. Let's have a conversation about it. And then to kind of ease their worry about the big picture of mental health, and I'm sure everybody on this phone call has the same theory, is that we have to scale it down. I personally have to scale it down to just my department. So I encourage coaches, yes, we have a big issue, but let's just scale it down to your team and see if we can get somewhere there. So we start with the coaches. They have to open the conversation. On top of that, we offer all kinds of things throughout the year through partner with academics. We do QPR training with the staff every 4 years. And then I do it every year with the athletic trainers. They're like Dr. Mark said, those are boots on the ground. That's like my first line of defense. I have to have those people very comfortable with this conversation. They're most hands-on. They see the first. So I spend a lot of time with the athletic trainers, coaching them, especially the younger ones, how to have the conversation, when to refer and when to friendly hand them off or when to keep them and have that conversation. That's another thing that we've been working a lot with coaching staffs and support systems is that, yes, if there's a clinical problem, you can send them straight to me. But a lot of this stuff that I think we're dealing with is they're conversating in their head. So just sometimes having a conversation with them can really alleviate some of that stress and anxiety, but people have to be comfortable with that. So the more that we do it, the more comfortable that we get. But telling coaches, it's okay to have that conversation. I want you to have that conversation has been, I think, very beneficial for us.
Wonderful. So start the conversation. I know we have a few ADs on the call today watching and who may be watching later on. So I like this approach of QPR and using some evidence-based practice for this kind of thing. And again, talking to your coaches individually about working with their particular team to have those conversations, not be afraid to have those conversations and kind of giving them the tools to do that. That's wonderful. Dr. Berkby, I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of the pandemic and its impacts on young people and their mental health. I know there are some college students who feel like they're technically seniors, but practically freshmen because they've spent so little time on campus. Are you seeing any trends, any changes in terms of how young people, how adolescents are coping, how they're doing?
Yeah, great question. And you referenced this at the very beginning of the talk today, and I think it's worth mentioning, but I think we need to acknowledge that we have a youth mental health crisis going on in our country, and it started well before the pandemic. So for the past decade, researchers and scientists have, documented a steep increase in the proportion of young people that are experiencing persistent sadness, hopelessness, anxiety and stress, and suicidal thinking, suicidal planning, and suicide death. In fact, the U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory about the youth mental health crisis in our nation and the magnification of that by the pandemic and what we should be doing as a nation. So from my point of view, the pandemic kind of has magnified the youth mental health crisis that was already there and growing. And so it's sort of a magnifying effect at a whole population level. And there are a lot of reasons why that might be occurring, and we probably won't go into all of those today. But I think that we've definitely seen the impacts of this in our practice. So we have many more young people, young adults, and young athletes seeking mental health support over the last 2 years. A lot of families have been under a lot of stress, and it's definitely being felt. And, a lot of that is from the disruptiveness that occurred, the added stress to families, and then the reduced socialization. So kind of those kind of factors kind of are the magnifiers, if you will, for the challenges that were already there. Now, many young people managed well. This isn't everybody, but at a population level, I think a lot of young people did feel increased stress. For a few, for some, it became unmanageable. But what we've seen is just more isolation, reduced socialization, and actually the need to learn how to re-socialize now that school's back in session for the most part and people are interacting again. Having to re-socialize has actually been an interesting phenomenon that I've seen. I was just talking with a Division I soccer player who was like, how do I meet these people? I've only met them on Zoom before. Like I'm a little bit anxious socially. How can I interact, with my new teammates who I've never met before, and now we're suddenly thrown together. So this idea of re-socializing, I think, has been really interesting as a current trend that I'm seeing. So I would just say that the pandemic has been a magnifier, and the effects are different, but mostly around isolation, increased stress, and then kind of learning how to re-socialize again.
Okay. Vanessa, Shannon, are you noticing, I know that Dr. Cormier mentioned Naomi Osaka and Michael Phelps, the athletes themselves, and I can put this to any of you guys today. Are you noticing a difference in how much the athletes themselves are willing to talk about mental health in the various places where you've worked, or certainly worked with a bunch of athletes over your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think the unfortunate answer is yes and no. I think some athletes are more willing to talk about it and have kind of provided a face and a voice for the topic. But, whether it was at the University of Louisville and the things that Kate and Dr. Peters and I would hear athletes say, Kate spoke to the importance of coaches being involved in the conversations earlier. And as hard as we worked over the past number of years together, we would still have athletes who might come in to see one of us and say, I don't want anybody else to know. And that's a sign that there still is a great deal of work that we need to do to break the stigma. I'm hopeful, right? I think the more people who come forward and are public with their struggle, the less people, to what Mark referenced earlier, have to struggle in silence. But as Kate and I used to talk about all the time, we weren't worried about the ones who were in one of our offices. We were worried about the ones who were out there struggling that we didn't know of. And so, before I left Louisville, and I know Kate will continue the work that she's doing with our student athletes to kind of magnify, to Ben's point, mental health, whether it's a club or whether it's recently Louisville did a campaign on social media, kind of public service announcement. All of those are really important, but just continuing to have open and honest conversations is really the foundation of all of that. It's great to have people come out on social media and on interviews with the media and talk about their struggles, but what about all the kids who aren't even willing to have those conversations at the dinner table in their own home? So, and again, well-intended, right? You're creating a home environment, you're creating an educational environment, you're creating a sporting environment. Some kids are just still not going to talk. But I think we have to do what we can as professionals wherever we are within the sport context and sport environment, to Kate's point, to continue the conversation, to continue to encourage people to talk about it, because the more we talk about it, the more normal it becomes to everyone to talk about it, and the less abnormal it becomes. So if you're an individual who has been struggling in silence, now you feel safe in saying something, safe in asking for help, safe in talking about it, safe in mentioning it.
Okay, wonderful. And Dr. Berkby, I know in the media they're referring to some of this with the term contagion. Is there a contagious nature to this, or a copycat nature to suicide as it relates to young people?
That's a good question. So the idea of contagion is that having exposure to suicide or suicidal behaviors, either in your family or your peer group or through media reports, can result in an increased risk for suicide among some at-risk or vulnerable people. And that is real. Contagion is a real phenomenon. It's been well documented. And it can occur through direct or indirect exposure. And it's particularly important for those young people and athletes that are already vulnerable or at risk. And there's a lot of factors that go into that probably are beyond the scope of this talk. But I think the important thing is that contagion can be minimized through a couple of important ways. One is through responsible communications and reporting about suicide. So if you are part of an organization or you're in a leadership role in one of your organizations and you may find yourself in the position about needing to communicate or speak to others about suicide, I would refer you to a website called reportingonsuicide.org. They have great evidence-based best practice information for organizations, media, just anyone who needs to be communicating responsibly. There's a lot of things to know about better and worse ways to talk about suicide when it's especially been in the media. Now, if there's been a suicide in your community, then I absolutely would suggest that coaches, parents, others check in with their athletes and teams. And again, just to what others have said already, just let them know that you're interested in how they're coping or how they're thinking or kind of absorbing the information. It's that opening the conversation, opening the door, making it something that is acceptable or okay to do, I think is absolutely important. And if you don't know how to do that, or you're very uncomfortable with these kind of conversations, or you worried about how to handle it if this happens or that happens, there are resources that you can access that just help you to navigate that. And a great one is called Seize the Awkward. And it's basically an idea that, it's awkward and maybe uncomfortable to have these kind of conversations with young people or with athletes. And so it gives a lot of tips for how to start the conversation, how to manage a conversation, what to do if, what to do after, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a website mostly geared towards younger people, but it's great for adults and parents and coaches as well. It's very relatable, very easy to digest. And I would just say that kind of related to a lot of the comments we've heard earlier, I mean, a lot of parents, coaches, and even athletes themselves are, struggling to be mentally tough or to have this idea that I need to be, resilient to adversity. And we as adults need to take the lead by example and lean in to these moments and these conversations that may be uncomfortable or tough. And so I think that we have to walk the talk. So this is our way to be leaning in to discomfort, and we need to do it.
I appreciate you connecting the dots for us there. So we know that young people can feel disconnected and isolated even when they're on a team or away in a big program, that there are risk factors for that. And sometimes, even though you've got all the protective and resiliency factors of being an athlete, that sometimes it can be tough to take that loss. And so if there's a suicide in the community or one featured prominently in the media, that we need to be that much more ready to have that conversation and not wait for a time to come to have it as soon as possible. Okay, I appreciate that. Dr. Peters, several of the NCAA athletes who have died by suicide recently, it appears to have been an act of impulse, not something planned in advance. What do our viewers need to understand about brain development, about young people, about impulsivity, sort of as it relates to depressive thoughts?
So, important point. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in the age group we're talking about, ages 10 to 24. So the developing brain is a component of that risk. And it's not without context, which you've heard in terms of the global issues, the national issues, that is the kind of external framework for all of us to live our lives. Then the individual is going through the rapid changing component of adolescence. And there's some literature that says anywhere from 50 to 75% of mental disorders have their starting point in both youth and adolescence, right? So again, it is a time period of life development that creates a certain amount of risk that's interacting with the stressors of the world. The mental health foundation is what the mental performance sits on. And so that's why this continues to be so important. They've done some pretty intense research where they have talked to people who have survived very serious near fatal suicides. And they kind of ask, at what point did you make that decision to end your life? And it's in the realm of about 2/3. It was within the hour prior to the attempt. So that speaks to that in the moment component that for a lot of people lead them to then make that attempt. It's not to say that others may not think about it in different times, or they may have thought about it before, may have thought through things before, but in that moment in time, for the folks who survived those very serious attempts, it really was a in the moment decision. So as we think through that, we think, well, developmentally, are there reasons that someone may struggle with that impulsive element? And if we think of how the brain develops, it sort of develops from inside out and back to front. And sort of the outer layers of our cortex develop later. So the emotional centers and all of our drives and things that are deeper in the brain tend to develop before our abilities maybe to manage those. And one of the things I always remembered in kind of some of my classes was in an adolescent brain, the gas pedal develops before the brakes. And so you think about our young people with all these changes, both physically and managing all the different stressors of high school and college and managing athletics, a lot of times they can become overwhelmed with the context that they're in. And that's when you're certainly at more risk of maybe something impulsive. And to this point, and this is a little bit of an aside, but not really. So if you think about little things you can recommend or do to prevent suicide, one is to minimize access to things people can hurt themselves with. So as simple as if you're a gun owner, keeping it locked up, keeping it separated where it can't be easily accessed, can lower the risk of suicide for folks in that household. That's just one example of little things that we all can do to hopefully create a safer place for those moments when maybe we're not doing as well.
Very good information. Thank you very much. So speaking more on the topic of kind of risk factors and what sorts of things might cause mental health impacts on athletes, Dr. Shannon, when a person is finished with their sport, they've finished their college career, or they're retiring from professional sport, whatever it is, or sidelined with an injury, how do we help promote that healthy perspective that there is indeed more to life, more to identity than just sport, just being an athlete? How do we help athletes see themselves as bigger than the sport, more than just this one talent or set of skills?
It's a great question, a challenging question from the perspective that becoming a master in your space and your sport requires a lot of energy, effort, time, dedication, sacrifice, et cetera. And particularly the population that we're talking about, high school, college, my work now in professional baseball, we're dedicating a lot of ourselves to that sport. And so inherently, a large portion of our identity is surrounding that sport. But what's really important to remember is that we are multifaceted in our social identity. And so I think what we have to do is we have to kind of rewire the understanding that and I just literally had a conversation with an athlete who's thinking about retirement about this. We have to rewire the understanding that I can be fully committed to my sport right now, but when I'm outside of my sport at home with my family or whatever it might be, I can be thinking and talking about what I might do next. What we know in terms of the studies that have been done on athletes, particularly retiring from sport, is those who had a plan after retirement tend to have a significantly better transition into that new career or that new life. The same thing can be seen in things like the military or in other professions where you really are required to sacrifice and dedicate a lot of your life and time to it. So again, I think the challenge is, can we as coaches, as administrators, as support staff, as family members, as parents, can we be challenging and encouraging our young athletes to continue to develop the other aspects of their identity, continue to measure themselves as an individual, not just on their athletic performance and what happens within their athletic identity, but what also happens within their other pieces of their identity. Challenging because, like I said, there is this constant push within the context and environment of sport to give everything, sacrifice your body and your life to the cause of the sport. We feel that even as staff members, it's just sort of this athletic culture now. So I think we all have to work collectively to sort of unwire that and rewire a different, healthier narrative where we can be whole people with multifaceted identities and be very good at our jobs, very good as athletes when we enter that environment, if that identity comes to the forefront. When we go home, our identity as an individual outside of athletics can come to the forefront and we can continue to grow that identity.
Very good. Thank you so much. Dr. Peters, we know from some of the parents who have lost their children to suicide that they feel there were no warning signs. And I know we've mentioned acts of impulse before, but can you talk a little bit about what sort of either nuanced or outright obvious signs that we might look for that tell us a child or a young person might be in trouble?
Yeah, so the hard response is you can't always know, right? But we do all the things that we're talking about to try to raise the possibility that what is in the shadows can come into the light, right? If someone is suffering. So the idea of what can we do to impact stigma, educating ourselves as providers, as coaches, as parents, educating the team and the individual, that all is the momentum to bring it into the light, right? So that more often someone may be likely to seek help. Or to share that they're struggling. So I think that's step one. Destigmatization is still an important goal. As a coach, what do I look for? How do I become aware? Well, the first point is I have to be willing to be aware, right? Willing to be open that yes, some of my athletes may struggle. They're in an age group that can struggle more often. So let me be aware and educate myself. And then I look for changes, right? What's different? They're not showing up. They used to be on time all the time. The performance has changed. I heard some information they didn't go to class. So you start to pick up that maybe something's different. So that becomes an important piece. Their functioning may be different. So again, being aware enough to be alert to those changes is really the key element as a coach or trainer or provider or a parent. Changes in their weight changes, changes in their behavior, hanging with different people. Maybe they're doing different things. Maybe all of a sudden they test positive on a drug test. Something that seems out of character, maybe just enough of a window in to then we can pick up and check in with them. And remember, these are all typically folks transitioning from high school to college and in new situations, and these can be quite big adjustments. I'd also look for any signs of injuries. Sometimes people self-harm when they're not doing well. So anything that you can't explain, scars or injuries, things like that. And also any increased frequency of negative statements that indicate maybe more despair, disgust, negativity towards themselves or others can be little clues or windows. So really the point is just being open and willing to be more alert to maybe those little clues that you might be able to pick up on.
Very good. Thank you so much. Dr. Berkby, I'm wondering, I've been working in psychology for a long time. I know you have too. And I know parents are sometimes scared to bring up the topic of suicide, scared that it will give kids ideas or give young people ideas. They don't want to put something on the table that perhaps that young person hadn't been considering before. Can you speak specifically to that concern?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And yes, it does seem that many adults are worried about bringing up mental health or suicide with young people for those reasons that you just suggested. So I think the first and most important thing to say is that there's no evidence that talking with you
No evidence.
about these topics plants the seed or increases the likelihood of the behavior. In fact, the opposite is probably truer, meaning letting young people know that you are interested in them, that you have a concern about them perhaps, and that you're willing to ask them if they're okay or struggling, or even having thoughts of suicide is protective, not harmful. So that, I hope that is loud and clear. So that's the most important thing to say. And then I say this to everybody, whether you are a friend, a parent, a coach, an athletic director, a sports psychology professional, and that is to trust your gut. If you have the feeling that something is not right or something is off with your athlete or your person, then trust that. Maybe you're wrong and that'll be great. But you know, our instincts are there for a reason and they are a guide. And I want people to listen to their instinct. And it's much better to take the risk and to ask somebody the tough or uncomfortable questions than it is to not. So trust your gut. And then I think I mentioned earlier, like if you're like uncomfortable in this space, you're not sure how to do this, you don't know how to talk about these topics, then there are resources like Seize the Awkward or others that you can look at, but for ideas. But the most important thing is trust your instinct, and there's no evidence that bringing this stuff up will cause it to happen. In fact, you may be protective.
Indeed. Thanks, Dr. Berkeley. Dr. Peters, kind of dovetailing with that, what other ideas do you have for our viewers today about how to bring up this topic, whether it's with your players, your staff, with your child? You've been working in sports psychiatry and you're very renowned in that profession. Tell us a little bit about what you know from all of your years of doing this work about what works.
So Dr. Berkeley, did you just say there's no evidence? Because I want people to hear that over and over. You bring this up, your gut tells you to bring it up. You're not creating more risk. It's protective. So I just want to highlight that. That's number one. Number two, I want everyone to sort of take a moment and see me now as Coach Peters. And I have an athlete with me today, and we're going to have a conversation. So Sam, thanks for coming in my office after practice here. I noticed maybe you just haven't been yourself the last few days. I just wanted to check in. You know, I care about you, not just as, you know, an athlete, but just you in general. What, are you okay? What's going on? Yeah, no, I'm good. Nothing going on here. Well, I'm glad to hear that. You know, just, you seem a little off. I you know, I didn't know if something's happening. Is anything changing, or are you having to deal with anything? No, I mean, you know, maybe my lady, we're, you know, having a little trouble. My girlfriend and I haven't been getting along, you know, but we're good. We're good. Everything's fine. Well, yeah, that can be pretty stressful. Thanks for, you know, thanks for letting me know. Is there anything, you know, I can help you with? Do you want to talk about this? Or I know since I'm coach, maybe you don't want to talk to me, but we got people you can talk to. You know, you're close to the trainer. You know, what can we do to help you? Coach, man, come on, man. I'm good. I don't need nothing. It's all gonna be fine. Well, I'm glad, you know, and I hope it does work out. But I'll probably, you know, bug you a little bit about it, you know, circle back around, check in with you, because we just want to make sure you know that we care about you, and we want to make sure we're doing what we can to support you, help you through whatever's happening. So thanks for talking. I'll probably check in later with you. So that's kind of how it might go. Now, some people may bite more than Sam did in terms of sharing. But some people, you know, wait a minute, coach is getting in on my business. I don't need this. Mental health's a whole thing of weakness. That's not me. Asking for help's a problem. You know, so you got to kind of manage through the barriers a little bit for some people. But you just stay with it, right? You be persistent. You circle back around. and you're coming from a place of caring. And for anybody who works with young people, relationship matters, right? That's, and Dr. I think it was Mark, Dr. Cormier said earlier, that trust element with trainers and that closeness becomes very critical for when people may be more comfortable to share. So again, the energy is setting the stage for staff to create the culture of that trust, that we value and care for you as a whole person and also as an athlete. And that becomes the momentum over time. It doesn't just happen with one seminar, right? It's the persistent efforts over time that allow that culture to be set and shifted as well. And that's QPR training, mental health first aid training, knowing a crisis number. I will mention and plug the national number that will launch in July. That is the 911 equivalent for seeking mental health support, and that would be 988. So again, the movement even nationally is to help people get the resources they need. So I'll probably leave it at that.
Very good. Thanks for that walkthrough. That was useful. So, okay, so we've talked a little bit about how to bring it up and how to broach that topic. And I think probably any parents or families who are watching that exercise just there, Dr. Peters, that was likely useful for talking a little bit about how not to just bring it up, but to create that space where that young person knows, I'm going to revisit this topic. I'm going to probably follow up with you and check in. And I really like what you guys have brought forth today with regard to setting the stage for everyone to know when they come to play in a program or for a particular coach, I care about you as an individual, as more than an athlete. This program cares about you. Your trainers care about you. Everybody from the top down cares about you, and creating that environment that way. So I appreciate that very much. And to that point, Kate, I was just wondering, kind of, you said a little bit, but be specific with us, any ideas that you have about how we set up this environment for programs. And as I mentioned, we've got a few coaches and ADs on today who are watching. So we're really wanting to hear what you have to say about that.
I think bringing in speakers are a great thing. For me, especially like, well, even our college student athletes, but definitely high school, because they're still at home, the parents need a great deal of training. You know, we've kind of left that part off in college because, you know, they're adults and they come in, but I think that's a great first step. We're actually working on that at U of L, our onboarding pass for our freshmen, where we would do a parent kind of question and answer. QPR trainings, I mean, the more trainings, the more you can talk about it, I think is helpful. Talking with them in a group, talking with them individually is helpful. There's tons and tons of launchings of mental health apps. The Calm app is something that we use at U of L. We found that very beneficial. Does that answer your question? Are you talking about?
Those are great. Yes, very much so. And if you have any questions, any of our viewers, please add those to the chat, because if we can, we'll get to those either at the end or maybe for a few minutes after the hour is over. Dr. Berkby, does social media play into this? Does being kind of a de facto public figure, playing sports, have an impact for young people?
Sure. Social media. Yeah, that's perhaps a whole nother webinar. But I think, you know, this idea of, you know, having a following that maybe knowing your performance statistics or tracking, you know, how things are going may be more relevant for college and professional athletes than maybe your average high school athlete. And others on the panel may work directly with athletes more than I do around how to manage and think about social media and its impact on performance and health. But from a performance standpoint, one of the things that I think is true and is needing to be addressed in some of the athletes I work with is that social media is just a distraction. And so, you know, kids are checking their phone during practice. They're maybe checking their mentions before a competition. Probably not the best time and place to be like on social media because it kind of reduces your focus and your ability to get ready to do whatever it is you need to do. So there's a performance element that relates to social media use. I think from a mental health perspective, one of the things that we're also learning is that some young people seem to be especially vulnerable insensitive to the social comparison aspects that happen on social media. And they're kind of keenly aware and sensitive to judgment that may be coming from others that can come across on social media. And over time, for some young people, that can lead to mental health distress. And so I do think we need to be talking with young athletes of all sorts, whether they're vulnerable or at risk or not, about kind of the norms and behaviors for using social media that might be helpful for them to think about, sort of when to use social media, when not to use social media, and teach them, like social media literacy, like how to understand social media and that it has a potential impact on you as a person or maybe as an athlete. And then also, and others have mentioned this, I think, just having a basic plan for how to think about managing social media is very, very helpful for just, anticipating and managing any negativity that may come across to you on social media. There can be a lot of hype that gets built up on social media, and managing the hype, so to speak, because that can create a lot of expectations in young people and kind of fuel that fire, so to speak. And then I think a lot of young people need to be guided to unplug a little bit and take a break. And in fact, there's some research that shows that can actually reduce mental distress. So taking a little break from social media is helpful. There are some young people who have a lot of trouble disconnecting more than others. And those are the ones that probably need our guidance the most. So I've actually worked with some athletes on deleting certain apps that seem to be the one that causes them the most distress, or just taking breaks, or thinking about when to be on and when not to be on. And then I think finally, it's worth mentioning that it's not social media use directly, but the impact it has on sleep, that it can have on sleep, is very important. So, a lot of young people, including athletes, are on their phones at night. And, there are a lot of reasons why that can impact sleep, but all young people, especially athletes, need to be getting good, consistent sleep for mental health and for performance. And so, if nothing else, a lot of athletes will buy into the idea that putting some parameters around my social media use is good for my performance, and through the avenue of sleep or whatever. And so helping young people to just learn and think about social media and how to manage it, I think, is absolutely important.
Fantastic. Dr. Peters, what if we suspect something? If you notice that a young person's behaviors seem off, like you said, they have shifted from the baseline that you typically would see from them, how then do we respond? I feel like athletes worry that they will look weak or vulnerable or will lose playing time. How do we I know we've talked today about building that system of support where they know the door is open, but how do we let kids know that they can trust us?
I knew it would get me at one point. So it occurs over time, right? And so to create the culture, the leaders down have to be the culture. I have to model what I'm hoping this culture looks like. So I create the safety element and the trust that this stuff can be discussed. That's number one. Safety is always first. I have to have a sense of what I would do if I have to ask an athlete, hey, you okay? And they say, no, I am not. And I'm in a bad place and I don't think I can be safe. I have to have an idea of what my next step is as a coach or a trainer. Is it, hey, let's go to the ER? Is it, hey, we have somebody on staff who I want you to connect with right now and sit with, and let's sort through where you're at and what you're thinking and feeling. For large universities like UK, U of L, we have systems of care that student athletes can access. For smaller school settings, it may be accessing the student health center or a community resource, but safety always is number one. What's the crisis plan for this organization if we get a response that safety is a concern? And then what are my resources within the context of my university or school or community that I can tap this person into if we're not at a safety concern level, but clearly they need extra support and care. And I also want to provide the idea that we think about mental health issues in the same way we think about the physical health. If I sprain my ankle, if I get a concussion, there is no weakness for getting care, having a stepwise response back to participation, a modification of that participation. You know, it's the same thing. If I'm dealing with depression, I may need modification. I may need a stepwise back. And it should be thought of in a similar rehab and healing model to mimic what we've been doing for physical ailments all along.
That is very useful information. Okay. Okay. And Dr. Berkby, should we be making safety plans with our young people? Should we be talking about, hey, if you're away at school and crap hits the fan, is that necessary, or what do you think?
I mean, I think it's always a good idea to talk with young people, including young athletes, about basic resources they can access should they find themselves in a crisis situation, either for themselves or for a friend. And, you know, so whether that's, you know, making a basic plan or something more formal, but just giving kids a basic information about, you know, what to look for and where to go. So, and the reason is that when, you know, when you're in a crisis, I mean, your ability to think clearly and to think well is diminished. That's not the time to be trying to figure out what your resources are and actions or steps to take for yourself or a friend. So having a basic plan already identified is extremely helpful. I think providing the National Suicide Lifeline, soon to become 988, is always a good good place to start. Letting young people know about 1 or 2 local resources in their community, very helpful. And then I always have young people identify at least one trusted adult that they know they can turn to. And then I have young people put this stuff on their phone. They've always have their phones.
I love that tip when you share it, Dr. Berkby. Can you say that one more time?
Yes, I have young people write this stuff down and save it on their phone in some way so that it's easily accessible. So they just have to pull it up. You don't have to, you know, have a piece of paper, you know, something to shuffle around, but just have 1 or 2 basic ideas absolutely embedded in their phone. And then for kids who are going to college, there are university resources that are available. Depending upon where you are, there may be mental health and sports psychology resources that can be accessed, and just getting athletes aware of and knowing how to connect to what those resources may be, I think is very important. And then if you do think you have a vulnerable or an at-risk athlete, then I would refer them to a professional mental health provider. Absolutely. But, you know, no harm in talking with young people about what their resources might, what they are, should they find themselves in a crisis. And I will say one final thing. At the same time that we've had a big increase in kids coming into our practice, I've also really noticed that a lot more kids are asking for help because they have someone they're concerned about as well. And I've absolutely noticed that. So yeah, this is on young people's minds. It's not something, not an unusual thing for them to be asking, I've got this friend I'm worried about, what should I do?
Fantastic. And we've talked today about protective factors and resiliency factors for athletics. Dr. Cormier, I just want to ask any parting words for our viewers with regard to toughness and mental health as it relates to sports.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, I think I say this to our coaches all the time, and anyone who will listen, to be perfectly honest. We have to destigmatize and normalize. I mean, I know it's been said a lot, and it feels like a cliche and sort of a kind of a buzz thing when we talk about mental health and suicide, but we can't sacrifice the health and our lives, or the health and safety in the lives of our individuals that we're you know, caring for the sake of performance. You know, what coaches and parents say to kids leaves an impression, and athletes are people. And if you approach coaching or parenting with this in mind, then you're already doing better than you think you are. I mean, there's a lot of pressure in sports, whether it's real or fabricated by the individual, whether it comes from within the household or from their coaches or society. Check in with them, check in to see if they're enjoying playing on this team and what you can do to make it more fun for them. Show them that you're a person that they can trust if they're feeling big feelings. Make sure they feel connected to someone on the team. Praise a performance, even if it wasn't nearly as good as what they're used to or someone else's. Mental health is tough because people are usually afraid to say the wrong thing. So people avoid talking about it. that's their defense mechanism, is I'm afraid of being the one that's going to say the wrong thing. So I'm just not going to say anything at all. And I think we've talked about that before in terms of like, say something. And there's always that hope that like someone else will down the line, but ultimately be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. Discussing it with kids and making it as normal as anything else that they're going through will make it infinitely easier for them to reach out if something isn't right. We have no problem talking about the importance of stretching and warming up to take care of our physical selves. Why can't we talk about the things that we do to ensure our mental health is being taken care of? And this shows them that it's an important piece of the puzzle. It's not just sport, not just about the sport, but as people. And kids place a lot of value on what coaches say and on what parents say. So if we start talking about this early, they'll listen and they'll think it's normal. We can't pretend like mental health won't impact our kids anymore. Everybody needs help with something at some point. And all of this always comes down to culture. And this is from a performance realm and from anything else realm. When you value it as the people on top, the people on the bottom will learn to value it as well. So if it becomes part of who they are as a team and they start looking out for each other, and they may notice things that you may not, and they may notice things because you taught them to pay attention. So ultimately it's a top-down approach. And I think the people who are in positions to make those decisions and to influence individuals have far more power. And I think if they take that into the right direction, we're doing tremendous work with just that. It's a simple thing.
Thank you so much. Kate, any parting words for the audience, anything that you want for our viewers to really take away from today? You've given us so much great information.
Well, first of all, thank you for putting this on. I appreciate it. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. When you say like, what can be done? This is it. It's many people listening, those of us that have been in it. Conversate. I have a 6-year-old. When we get in the car on Friday, the whole way home, we talk about how to be a good friend and not be a bully. He's 6, I know. But that's the power of the culture. My house is built in a certain way. It's the same way as teams, is athletic departments. You build it and the rest will kind of fall into place, but it's got to start at the top. So very good work here. I appreciate you having me. And Dr. Birkby, I'm going to make sure that I get you an up-to-date basketball poster that you have in the back. And
thank you.
Dr. Cormier, I'm going to send you one too. You probably need some black and red in your life. Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Shannon, just want to hear some more from you. Thank you for being here today. And again, congratulations on the new gig with the Cincinnati Reds. Anything that you want for our audience to take with them, that is, today?
Well, thank you. And thank you, like Kate said and everyone said, for putting this together, because this is the type of thing that needs to continue to occur. And thank you to all the participants for attending, because listening and learning is certainly the first step. It's been said many times, but I don't think it can really be said enough. I had a really good friend, my best friend from college, call me the other day. She works in healthcare, and they had a patient report suicidal ideations, and she called me in a panic. She said, my adrenaline's firing. I think I did the right thing. Did I do the right thing? So the point of that is, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be awkward. You're going to question whether you did it correctly afterwards, but I think we can't say it enough. Say something, ask something, continue the conversation. The first time someone expressed to me that they wanted to harm themselves and take their own life was really uncomfortable. And I'm educated in it. I'm trained in it. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. But as everybody has expressed, there's so much impact in that one conversation that can be had. And I think Kate and Mark and everybody really mentioned this. Parents as well need help. They need to be trained. They need to be educated. And we may have some parents on the webinar. We might have coaches, administrators. Offer opportunities, as Kate mentioned, they're going to do at Louisville, to help your parents have those conversations. What questions can I be asking my student athletes that won't get the answer good, great, fine? I'm thinking to myself, the things that I've challenged my brother and sister-in-law to ask my nephews that have really been impactful. And things like, how do you feel physically? How do you feel mentally? Don't settle for good, great, fine. Ask them to identify actual feelings. So creating a conversation that allows for further conversation, I think can't be talked about enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Berkey, any parting words for our viewers today?
Yeah, I would say that mental health issues are there, whether you pay attention to them or not, and they're operating, whether you pay attention to them or not. So pay attention to them.
Very good. I know when I've been working with parents over the years, when something like this comes up or they're worried about it with their kids, I'll encourage people, take a deep breath. If your child tells you something that scares you or you don't know what to do with, say, I'm glad you told me. Take that deep breath. Let's make a plan. So thank you all so much. Dr. Peters, anything you want for that? You've given us so much great information. So that was a great exercise earlier and actually how to do this. Anything that you want for folks to take with them today?
Well, first, listen to the panel.
Watch, rewatch it.
That's right. Secondly, we talked about educating ourselves, building the trust, model it. Right? What's the most effective way to parent? Is behaving the way you want your kid to behave. Same with coaching. And I'm going to steal from Dr. Berkby. He said earlier, lean in to the discomfort, right? And I think it's clear any tough conversations are always internally uncomfortable, but it's time to lean in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So that's about it for today. We've shared a lot of resources with you guys in the chat area, and our panelists have graciously agreed to stick around for a few minutes and answer any specific questions that you might have. The Kentucky Psychological Foundation and Association, we are dedicated to providing these kind of community public education events and advancing the well-being of Kentuckians and beyond. So if you're interested in making a donation to see more of these type of presentations, please visit Kentucky Psychological Foundation's website. Sam will add that to the chat right now. I want to thank all of our panelists for when we made the call to ask you to participate. Everybody here was quick to say that they would be on this call and be happy to do it. So I really appreciate your willingness to be here and share what it is that you know. Thank you to everybody watching. We are delighted that you were here. If you need anything else, like we say, visit KPA or KPS websites. Thank you. Everybody have a great Friday. Stick around if you have any more questions. Okay. So Sam, are we still recording?
Yes, we're still recording. We'll record for about 5 more minutes in case anyone has questions.
Okay.
Can I answer Abby's question? I wanted
Yeah.
to.
Yes, please. Can you restate it for us?
Sure. Yeah. Let me read it over here. Abby, let's see.
I can read it for you, Mark.
Yeah,
It'll be like an actual question and answer.
All right.
So, Dr. Cormier, you have done a lot of work to establish your presence at UK. Any tips on getting coach or athletic administration buy-in to spend time or other resources on mental health training, especially those who have been in the profession a long time?
Yeah. And feel free to jump on this too, Vanessa, because I know that both of us sort of entered a department as kind of the first sports psych people to ever be in that department. So it was kind of new to everybody. It's interesting because there's a, I kind of label sports psychology, mental health, and athletics as sort of the have and the have-nots, right? So there's the Power 5 conference schools, the ones with big budgets and a lot of money, and the ones that are able to afford to provide resources like us. And then there's sort of like the mid-level schools who may have, dedicated money, even though they're not bringing in the big bucks. And then there's the rest who are relying heavily on university counseling centers and outside contracts and community practitioners and things like that. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I'm in a big budget institution where there's money to be spent. As much as I talk about, like, you could still spend more money, you could always spend more money on this. The quick answer is advocate, 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 advocate. And so if you find yourself in a position where you have the ear of somebody in a money spending position, talk about the importance of it. And I think what resonates with a lot of administrators and a lot of these individuals is data. We don't have a lot of data in terms of saying like, meeting with me is going to increase a person's performance by this much. And so, let's just share me as a resource to everybody. But we do have data that we've shared throughout this webinar regarding, these are the numbers are increasing, student athletes completing suicide and all these different kinds of things, which is concerning. And so let's get ahead of this. Let's not become another statistic. Let's not be, another department that's posted on the front page of the newspaper and so on and so forth. So get into those uncomfortable discussions and don't be afraid to say like, yeah, strength conditioning is great. Fantastic. But like, if we're going to hire another position and you're debating between mental health, sports psychology, or strength conditioning, like look at the disparity in numbers. We have an army of strength conditioning coaches here at University of Kentucky. So for me to say like, let's spend, instead of adding one more, let's add one more of me. And lighten the load on me so I can be more present and be more visible and be on the practice pitch and all that kind of stuff. And, be proactive in that realm. So it's difficult because I think we have a tendency to like, I just want to be grateful that I have a job and I don't want to rock the boat and I don't want them to get pissed off and then say like, well, we're going to hire somebody who's not going to keep asking for more resources. Like, it can't work that way. You have to keep pestering them and pestering them and pestering them, because this is something that as we've said throughout the webinar, that is just like, we can't ignore this anymore. Like, it's just not something that is just going to be like on the side as a footnote of anything. So Vanessa, Kate, Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, because you're both, or all three of you in or were in an athletic department, but that's been my experience.
The one thing I think I would add that I think, and Kate can speak to this as well, is, unfortunately, college athletics in particular, and the trickle down effect is happening in junior and youth sport, and obviously professional sport. It's a business. And so the bottom line is there, and it can be restrictive. So how do you convince people, like Mark was speaking to spend the money? I think liability and risk are something that people listen to. And it's unfortunate that they just don't listen to, like, we have to care about our student athletes as human beings. We hope that they do. We hope they listen then, to Mark's point. But if they don't, then I think you have to like strong arm them. You have to say, like, think about the risk, think about the liability. Like, do you want to be on the cover of the newspaper for something like this? And again, it's unfortunate that we're at that place, but it's because everybody here understands mental health. Not everybody understands mental health. There are still people out there who think that you just got to be more mentally tough. That's why you're not mentally healthy. And we talked about that at the beginning of the webinar. It is what it is. It's sort of a stages of change approach. You have people who are still in contemplation about mental health. And those people you might have to jar into action by threatening liability and risk. So that's just something I would add. Kate?
Yeah, definitely threaten them with a liability for sure. Everybody's like, oh, retention. A lot of that comes back to retention for us. Is bottom line is unhappy athletes don't play well. And if we can triage and take care of them, stabilize them outside of their sport, we have a better chance. So do you want players to be engaged and focused? Yes. Okay, well, here's how we can do that. These are the steps that we can do. Fortunately for me, I came in under Dr. Peters. He had been here for, I don't know, 40 or 50 years. I feel like, I'm just joking. Prior to me coming in. So he had really set a very strong foundation, had some good relationships. And then my first strategy was to sit down as not the professional with the coaches, to sit down in their world, what they go through. And then I just kind of manipulated it and turned it into my situation. And I also had a phenomenal coworker with Dr. Shannon that spent a lot of time with those coaches right up in their ear. A perfect example is that we had a young person, an athlete really struggling with the yips. I don't know if people know exactly what that is, but the athlete we had under control. It was the coach's verbiage and her approach to it that was going to blow the deal. So Dr. Shannon gets right in between them, refocuses the coach, explains to her, like, we're in a bad place right now. What you're doing is not going to help. This is the solution. I'm giving it to you. So it's really about that connection with the coaches, letting them know that you're working with them you're not an authoritative figure. You're not telling them to do things. It's just, how do we do things better? Building on their strengths is also a huge psychological tool. You're doing this well, we build on that, and then we can gradually circle back around to what you're not doing very well.
I want to add a final comment to that. I am to a point now where I think this is year 5, just the conclusion of year 5 with UK Athletics. I am now being embedded into the recruiting visits. And I've used that as a selling point with a lot of coaches and administrators to say, like, parents are going to want to know that I exist, that I'm accessible, and that, like, I am forming that relationship before they even agree to come here. And so, like, I'm meeting the parents, we're talking about the different, how to access, who to talk to, where's my office. Sometimes they even meet me in my office so that they can physically show their kids, like, this is something that this university is offering. So I'm like, sometimes speak their language, like speak the administrator language in terms of, Vanessa talked about return on investment. Like, it's easy to rationalize an additional coach or strength coach because it translates directly into this. But if we're saying, like, you might get that next big recruit because we're offering something that the other university is not. Or even though you both offer it, you took the time to introduce this person to a professional that, like, is an embedded part of the puzzle, as opposed to somebody who has an office down a deep, dark hallway in a dungeon without any windows or something like that, which some people are. And so it's, anyway, so.
Very good.
I'm sure there are other questions.
We did have a question from Gunther Carpenter related to, in your experience, folks, have you seen programs, do we screen athletes for mental health symptomology when they enter the program? Is that happening?
We do that at our PPEs. We do the GAD. Chris, jump in on the depression.
I think we do the PHQ-9, I think, is for the kind of depression symptoms, and the GAD for the anxiety. And we do, when they enter campus for their kind of physical to begin the year and things, we'll screen. And then if they kind of show a positive on a screen, there's a concerning answer, then Kate is available for, hey, pull out, let's sit down, let's kind of explore this. And so we can get on top of it in more of a preventative way, as opposed to reactive, later down the road.
And Dr. Shannon and I both try to be at physical. So when they enter at that moment and they fill it out, I pull them aside. It's, there's a full day for them, 1,000 people in there. So it's just about, like, here's the screening. Here's what we see. This is who I am. Here's my number. And then usually I will set up a follow-up appointment with them for a week or two later, just to check in. Was it a first year kind of jitters or, something else? So yes, we try to screen them the best we can. We also do it yearly. So when they enter back in sophomore, junior, senior year, we do that same round.
Yeah. And it's less about what screen you use and more about just finding your system's best way to have some screening element. I mean, the U.S. Olympic Committee has some various things that they use that can be, towards more athlete screening. But the key is doing the screening, or having at least some capacity to do that, can be very helpful and preventative, which is ultimately what you want to do. The other thing regarding building the system is don't be discouraged by it happening slowly. So I started in 2004, and we're eons different from whence I started. And you just stay persistent with it and build each piece. And then you look back over time and say, hey, we've really created some differences.
Wonderful. Sam, yes,
sorry,
please.
Can I just add one thing about the screening? When Kate arrived at U of L before I joined, and Dr. Peters had been there prior to that, and Dr. Peters is off campus, Kate was embedded in the athletic department. And it was really Kate that, this is the most important point. You can't just screen, because what was happening before Kate got on campus, because Dr. Peters was external, is the athletic trainers were collecting the questionnaires and then they were just putting them in a file somewhere. And that isn't going to do any good. So Kate, and with the encouragement of Dr. Peters, that's how integrating it into PPE with Kate present became a thing. Like, we have to be there as the resource right then. And I think it's an important note to Dr. Peters' point about the slow build for high schools, smaller colleges, to Mark's point, that may not have a budget, you have to have an external resource, whether you hire someone from the counseling center to come over and be that person for you that day, to be able to look at those screens, at those assessments, whether you get someone in the community that you hire on contract to come in, you have to have someone right there. That's the stopgap. You can't put those papers in a folder or file somewhere and be like, well, we screened them, right? You actually have to do something with that data.
Yeah, and some individuals may be, working with youth sport athletes, and that they're not psychometricians, then be able to use all of these metrics and scales and things like that. Like if you're coaching a youth baseball team, like there's nothing wrong with you sitting down and having a conversation about like, are there any things that you're coming in with like, do you have any big worries or things that are, pervasive or anything like that? Like, just having those easy conversations, not just talking about like, what are your goals for this season and where do you hope to go and what position do you think you want to play and what's you hope your batting average is going to be like. Talk about different things and talking like related to this. So I'll shut up now.
Perfect. Great information. I think that is all of the questions that we've received. So I believe our work here is done, at least for today. So thank you all very much for joining us and for being part of this panel discussion. This has really been a good one. So appreciate your participation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.